All right, so I'm going to do a few things, but first, who wants to be an entrepreneur here? Oh, great. Perfect. Start your own company, work for a startup. Is anybody a developer here? Yeah. Yeah, you guys are going to succeed. Yeah, no one else here is, though. No, I'm just kidding. So, yeah, that's good to know. So I'll do a few things here. First let me tell you about Silicon Slopes Beehive startups, and then I'll tell you kind of how this all happened. So we recently, has everyone heard the term Silicon Slopes? Have you heard of Beehive startups? You like Beehive startups better, I assume, because that's the one I started. So we recently took over Silicon Slopes, and we created a 501c3 nonprofit organization to empower Utah's startup and tech community to learn, connect, and serve. And all three of those are buzzwords, but I'll go in a little bit more detail. You guys know who these folks are, like Josh. Josh actually started Silicon Slopes in 2009. And then when he sold Omniture to Adobe, right here, Silicon Slopes was part of that acquisition, which actually, interestingly, gave Beehive an opportunity to kind of sneak in there. But so this is our board. I assume you guys have heard of these folks. Yeah, so these guys help us with connections, and we do a variety of different things. Again, I'm just going to tell you what we do, and then we'll open it up because I want it to be like pretty interactive. So on the learn piece, like I said, we empower Utah startup and tech community to learn, connect, and serve. The learn piece is where we got our start. I graduated from UVU, as Mark said, and I remember taking this class with Shauna Theobald, who's probably my favorite person in the entire world. And I remember Josh James spoke at this thing the same semester where I was, here. So, and next semester we have Josh coming in, and I think all of those folks are coming in to speak at this class. So unfortunately, you got like this semester where I'm speaking instead of them. But so we got our start because, as Mark said, I graduated from UVU, but I didn't graduate in like business or entrepreneurship or any of that stuff. I graduated in journalism, which, so I was like a communications major with a journalism emphasis. Kind of pointless, to be honest with you, but I wanted to learn how to write. So I did. So the idea behind Beehive Startups originally was simple. I was working at Izeni, we running Izeni with two other co-founders, Gabe and Jordan Gunderson. Izeni is a software development firm. We work with early stage startups, help them build their product, get it to a point where, if you guys heard the term MVP, minimal viable product. So we'd help startups build that, right? We'd help them build their MVP. Eventually they'd be able to transition to an in-house team. We'd help them raise a little bit of money. So we've been actively involved in Utah startup and tech community for almost a decade. Helping startups build their product, interacting with investors so that investors would invest in that startup and that product, and then we'd help them recruit their in-house dev team, which is why when I said if you're a developer, there's always going to be a job for developers. So we launched Beehive Startups 4 years ago when one of our startups, Weave, has anyone heard of Weave? We helped to build Weave. At least early on. Now that obviously they have their own in-house team. But I'm going to put this down for a sec. So we helped build Weave, and Weave got into Y Combinator. Has anyone heard of Y Combinator? It's like the Harvard of accelerators. It's a big, kind of really prominent Silicon Valley accelerator. A lot of big companies have come out of there, Airbnb, Dropbox. So it's a big deal when you get in there. You get in, they give you $120K, they take 7% of your company. But most importantly, they help you raise money and get connections and really kind of learn how to build a startup. So we've got in there, and we were excited, obviously, because they were the first Utah startup to ever get into Y Combinator. And we wanted to tell people, right? We wanted to tell people that, hey, we've just got into Y Combinator, but there's no way to spread that information. KSL wasn't writing about startups, still don't. Deseret News doesn't. Salt Lake Tribune, Daily Herald. Like I said, Josh had just done this acquisition with Omniture and Adobe, so Silicon Slopes was kind of dormant at the time. So no one was covering these startups and these entrepreneurs and telling their stories. And so the idea for us was pretty simple. Hey, we could do that. I put no thought into the name. I wish I had. We probably wouldn't have ended up at that name. But I bought beehivestartups.com for $10. We set up a pretty simple little blog, and I just started writing stories. I need to update some stuff, it looks like. That's going to throw me off, so hang on one sec. Okay. So we just started telling stories, and we just started, and I wanted it to be really honest. I wanted it to be authentic. I didn't want it to be a press release shop. I wanted the stories we wrote to really kind of grasp and help the community understand what was happening. So I would write pretty lengthy stories on folks. I remember doing a profile on Davis Smith from Cotopaxi before they even launched Cotopaxi, and telling this story about this 9-year-old kid he'd met named Edgar that was kind of like the whole impetus for starting Cotopaxi. And we got to meet a lot of incredible entrepreneurs through that, right? And so when we launched, we thought, hey, this will be 10 hours a week for me. We'll all keep our day jobs. And that's it. There was never any sense of like what it would become. Certainly never thought it would become what it is now. But the idea was just to tell stories. So we started doing that, and we'd publish maybe 3 or 4 every week. And it really started taking off. People were really enjoying these stories. And I think more than anything, even more than like the stories themselves, they loved the fact that finally someone was covering this community and telling these stories and letting people know what was happening. So the community pushed us to do more. They said, hey, you should do events. You should do workshops. You should introduce startups to investors. I mean, there's a million things. I got a little nervous when Mark said you guys should reach out to me to get connected to mentors, because that like there's a million things that will get thrown in our direction. And focus is super important for an organization like ours. Otherwise, you get this, you're kind of doing everything, but you're not good at anything, And we've certainly gone through those phases as a company. So as the community was pushing us to do more, we did our first event. We did it at BYU. I still remember it because Mitt Romney in that same building was speaking at the same time as our event, and there was a BYU basketball home game. And I thought, if we get 15, 20 people to show up, this will be like this fantastic, successful event. And we had, I think, over 500 people show up to our first event. And that's where the first time we realized, hey, this is a thing. People are liking what we're doing. They're grasping, the stories. We become somewhat of a voice for this community. And the fact that we can pull people away from Mitt Romney in a BYU basketball game on a Wednesday night. I still remember I stood up, grabbed a mic just like this, and said, "What are you doing here?" I don't even know who the speakers were. They weren't great, probably. Now, if anyone Googles who that was, I'll say that they actually were great. But they weren't like really big names. And it was just amazing that many people would show up. And then it just kept happening. Every month we'd throw an event and 400 people would show up. Then 500 people would show up. And then we said, hey, let's throw the largest Startup at Tech event in Utah's history. And we sent out an email to our newsletter list saying, hey, we just launched the largest Startup and Tech event in Utah's history. It's going to happen in January. And we were calling it that when not one person had registered to show up to this event. So we weren't sure that it was going to be the largest one. And we didn't even know what the largest one previously was, to be honest with you. So we weren't even sure what we were looking for. Turns out the largest one was like 800 to 1,000 people, something like that. So we threw this event, Start SLC, and it brought in over 4,000 people, folks from across the country. We had, I don't know if you guys remember this story or if you're even interested in it, but Zenefits, during Start SLC, was going through a pretty big controversy with the governor's office and GoEd. They had been kicked out of the state of Utah. because Zenefits is like an insurance broker, but they're not. They kind of give the services away for free. And we let out on the reporting of that all the way leading up to Start SLC, and we brought Zenefits CEO Parker Conrad, who is now no longer the CEO, and that's another crazy kind of story. We brought him out, and he addressed like a crowd of about 1,000 people right during the legislative session of the state legislature. This was like the end of January in 2015. And that was awesome. That was great attention for us, but it also kind of showed, hey, Utah has a startup and tech community that will rally behind entrepreneurship and speak out for, folks like Zenefits and others who we felt may be mistreated by the government. And they actually, during that legislative session, passed a law allowing Zenefits back in. So that was awesome. And the fact that we actually did pull off the largest startup and tech event in Utah's history was awesome. But I still remember, and I don't know, Mark, if you were there, I still remember at the finale of Start SLC was a startup competition, and we did a $250,000 startup competition. And I still remember, I think this is probably the greatest event we've ever done, even until today. Just the energy in that building and the fact that finally someone had pulled something like that off was super exciting. So that's kind of how we got to where we are now. We spun it out of Izeni eventually, soon after Start SLC, once we realized, hey, this is its own thing. This has nothing to do with software development. This is a community organization. We spun it out of Izeni. And for a while, we were just pushing on this Beehive brand. Sometimes we were even critical of the name Silicon Slopes, which I won't get into because we now run it. And eventually, we held another event called Start Fest, which is kind of like Start SLC, but we wanted it to be a national startup and tech event and to be able to bring folks from Silicon Valley and New York and Boston and just across the country here to Utah. We thought Utah should have its own South by Southwest or something like it, right? And so at Start Fest, I had Josh come from Domo to speak. And before he came out and spoke, he and I had about 45 minutes in the green room, just he and I. And we had this kind of interesting rivalry, friendly rivalry, but still like a rivalry between Silicon Slopes and Beehive Startups. Because while we were, during this period where we had launched Beehive Startups and kind of done Start SLC and stuff like that, he had pulled it out of Adobe and he was again running Silicon Slopes. So in some ways we were competing with, probably the most prominent and successful entrepreneur in Utah, in this kind of weird community building thing where nobody made any money though. So I had a chance to talk with him and I said, hey, this doesn't make any sense that there should be two of these. We should join forces. Let's figure out what that means. And over the next 6 months, we did eventually figure out what it means. We created a new, nonprofit organization. We put both Silicon Slopes and Beehive Startups inside it. We put kind of the other, top entrepreneurs in the state that you would expect to be on a board like that on the board. And the idea now is let's just blow this thing up. We haven't announced this yet. Actually, this isn't even public information, but it will be because that camera's on. But within the next, before that airs, it'll be announced. So that's where we're at now as an organization. And so these are all the things that we do. So we have siliconslopes.com, beehivestartups.com. This Sunday, we will launch a KSL radio show called the Silicon Slopes Hour. It'll be every Sunday morning at like 7 a.m. So make sure you wake up, set your alarms. Then we have a weekly newsletter, Beehive Startups weekly newsletter. We do a thing at Sundance every month where we'll bring a high-profile entrepreneur like Ann Miraco, who really, that event tomorrow, you guys should go to. Floodgate is one of the most prominent Silicon Valley venture funds, and Ann has been called by, I think, a number of publications the most powerful woman in startups, which is a lot to live up to. And she does. You should really go check that out. If you do miss it, though, obviously we're recording it as a podcast. So Silicon Slopes Lives, we bring people to Sundance. Ann isn't at Sundance because we haven't announced what Silicon Slopes Live even is. But starting next year, we will, bring high-profile folks from across the country to Sundance, and you guys can all come, and there'll be similar recording for the podcast. Silicon Slopes Summit is an event just like StartFest, where we're building this national event. We're launching a quarterly magazine in January as well. We're doing our own institute, so workshops, 8-week workshops around specific topics. The first 4 are going to be around sales, product, entrepreneurship, and tech. And then we're doing this lecture series. That's on there, Mark. We do a calendar. I don't know why we do a calendar, but we've always done it, so we're going to continue to do it. And then we have other things. So this is what the website does. It does about 120K unique monthly visitors, 20K subscribers, 7,000 podcast listeners. This is, the summit, a similar event like StartFest or Start SLC. This magazine we're launching will actually be the largest distributed magazine in the state of Utah, because we partnered with Utah Business, and we're doing an additional 15,000, 20,000 subscribers on our own. So that's kind of exciting. Silicon Slopes Live, as I mentioned. So that's the learn piece, right? In a lot of ways, we're a media company. That's how we started. At the heart of everything we do is we publish 2 to 3 stories a day. We're interacting with our community all the time. So when we say, hey, we're going to put on the largest startup and tech event in Utah's history, for whatever reason, they believe us because we have some credibility, on the media side of things. So, and on the Connect side of things, we do roundtables every month. We do this monthly event called the Startup Conversation Series. This is the first event we ever did. This is our, longest running event. This is the one where, where Mitt and the BYU basketball game was coming. Folks came in. We do a breakfast where we bring in, folks like Aaron Sconard and Josh James to talk to other, up-and-coming entrepreneurs. It's a little bit more intimate setting. We do Launch Up, which again has been around for a long time. Roundtables, mentor sessions. We do a lot of crap, right? And then, so probably the most important thing and the biggest thing on the board for us is this serve piece, right? Like, we have to make sure as an organization that the Silicon Slopes don't rise while the rest of Utah, remains stagnant or gets left behind. I don't know if you paid any attention to what's happening in Silicon Valley. Everything in Silicon Valley is amazing if you're in the startup and tech community. If you're not, Silicon Valley is kind of the worst possible place to be, because it's like $1.5 million for 1-bedroom house or 1-bedroom apartment in Silicon Valley, and we're on track, maybe not to be as big as Silicon Valley, but that's happening here in Utah. And we as a startup and tech community, and you guys all who want to be entrepreneurs, need to be thinking about that. Like, hey, let's make sure we don't, leave the rest of this community behind. As, because homelessness is rampant in Silicon Valley. It's crazy what's happening. The divided classes in Silicon Valley. It's kind of crazy. So we think about that all the time. It's a huge concern for us as an organization. It's a huge concern for us as a community. And so we think of ways that we can help there and ways that we can give back and kind of serve the broader community as well as our own. So one of the things we do is Startup Santa. And last year, and just to give you a sense like how the startup community works and how, like, when you're an entrepreneur, quickly things could move. I had a meeting with Bill Holterstrom, who's the president of United Way here in Utah. And I said, hey, this was last year after Thanksgiving. I said, hey, we have the opportunity to rally Utah startup and tech community around something. What should we rally them around? And he said, hey, we don't need food, plenty of food during the holidays. We don't need toys, plenty of toys during the holidays. But children living in low-income families, only 1 out of every 300 has access to books. Can you help us out with something like that? And in that meeting, we bought the domain startupsanta.org. Within a few days, we had the website up, and within 3 weeks, we launched this statewide book drive where all these startup and tech companies competed against each other to see who could raise the most books for children living in low-income families, and we raised around $70,000, 14,000 books within 2 weeks. So that's the power that this community has, and that's the power of organizations like this, and the power that all of you have to make a difference. just by doing stuff. There's kind of no substitute just for just doing stuff. So we did that, and if you want more details, Hannah has flyers on Startup Santa. So another interesting story around this serve piece that I always tell is early on in Beehive's history. This was probably 4 to 5 weeks in. Again, all we are is a blog at this point. I'm on Twitter and I see a local reporter tweet out something that said something like, local 15-year-old beekeeper has honey and beekeeping equipment stolen from bee rustlers. And immediately I'm intrigued, right? Like, number one, like, what's a bee rustler? That's a fascinating term just in general. Is that like a career path that I could maybe pursue? And number two, and more seriously, well, not more seriously, number two, this kid's running a literal beehive startup, and that's the name of our organization. So we have to help this guy out, right? This guy is literally running a beehive startup. Our name is Beehive Startups. How can we help him? And so what we decided to do, this is around the time that GoFundMe had just launched, and people were doing kind of GoFundMe things. So we decided to do a GoFundMe campaign. This kid had lost $12,000 worth of honey and beekeeping equipment, and they stole his queen bee, which is fascinating. Like, the queen bee is super valuable, maybe the most valuable thing. And so we said, hey, let's go see. And again, we're 5 weeks into it. We're not what we are now, where we can just call up Aaron Sconard and Josh James. We were nobody. And we said, hey, how can we help this kid out? This is interesting. We have this kind of unique little story that we can point to, that he's running a beehive startup. We are beehive startups. Let's see if we can do something. So we launched a GoFundMe campaign, and we did this video. And the idea was we would get a bunch of Utah entrepreneurs all across the Silicon Slopes of the Wasatch Front to appear in this video. And so we got one of the Studio C producers to film it and kind of make the video. And for 2 days, we went up and down I-15, stopping at companies, asking them if they'd appear in this video. Everyone said yes. It's the first time I met Aaron Sconard, actually, who's now a really good friend and mentor, was when I was doing this video. And so we got them all, and the whole time we're just laughing, right? Because we're getting all these CEOs to appear in this video. It's this funny little deal, this strange coincidence where a kid is running an actual beehive startup, and that's our name. And it was just funny, and it was, hilarious. And then at the end of the second day, for the first time, we met this 15-year-old beekeeper. And his name was Bryce Bunderson. And all of a sudden, it wasn't funny anymore, because $12,000 for Bryce Bunderson was everything. $12,000 for Bryce Bunderson's family was everything. That was how they were going to pay their mortgage. That was how they were going to, pay for school supplies, pay for clothes. And all of a sudden, it got really real that, hey, we have to raise $12,000 because this is super, super important for the Bunderson family. And that's maybe the first time, and maybe where you can trace back this whole serve pillar of what we do as an organization and why we think it's so critical, because we realize, hey, we can make a real difference in people's lives just by rallying this community together. And we ended up raising, I think, around $15,000 for Bryce. And on top of that, interestingly, we raised the $15,000, and then a honey and beekeeping supply company actually donated everything that he had lost. So he got all of his equipment and stuff back, and he got an extra $15K. So we were excited about that, but more importantly, we realized for the first time kind of the power of just, again, no substitute for just doing something and trying, and really kind of the power of this community to kind of give back and help, right? And so, those are the three things we do: learn, connect, and serve. And we're obviously really tied in to, and really, and in a lot of ways, kind of at the heart of Utah's startup and tech community. I would say all the way from Provo to Ogden, that's kind of the Silicon Slopes at this point. we're very tight in, and so I want to leave maybe even a little extra time than you normally do to answer any questions and see how we can help you. So yeah, let's start there. Who has questions?
Okay, anybody? How do you, so for students kind of starting out that have these early ideas, what advice, what recommendations do you have to help them kind of make that first step or kind of get things rolling?
Yeah, so I would say like don't overthink it and just start doing it. Like again, there's really kind of no substitute for just doing it. Because you will for sure, even if you think it out and you have a plan and you took 6 months and you really kind of, first I'm going to do this, and then second I'm going to do this, and third I'm going to do this, and you have this beautiful business plan, right? And the first step for sure won't happen like you thought. So it's totally pointless whatever happens after that. And that's what we did with BI Startups, right? So I went around, I didn't know anybody. I didn't know any of these folks. When Josh came and spoke at the UVU entrepreneurship class, it's been a while. It's not recent, but like 5 years ago. I didn't know who Josh James was. He didn't know who I was, right? But at the very beginning, I would just call people. I would send emails. I would say, hey, we launched this publication. I want to come write about you. I'd go interview them. I'd be respectful of their time. And then I would go back and I would write the very best story I possibly could. Because I knew there were two people I were writing about, and one was the most important. I was writing for, sorry. There was two people I was writing for. One was kind of just the general community to let them know, which is important. But most important was that person was for sure going to read it, right? When I wrote about Davis Smith, when I wrote about Aaron Sconner, when I wrote about these folks, I knew no matter what, I didn't care like how many views that these articles got. I knew one person for sure was going to read it, was the person I just wrote about, because who doesn't read stories that were written about them, about you? And so we just started, and that's how we build up this kind of incredible network. I'd be lying if I said, I'm just going to close this because I don't think we need it. I'd be lying if I said like we had like some plan, or we had thought like at the very beginning that this is where we would end up into kind of this amazing, really a movement more than anything else. We just started. We just did it, and that's the same thing with the Bunderson thing.
Before I ask my question, I just want to say thanks. I've attended a lot of Beehive startup events, and it's really inspired me to pursue entrepreneurship. So thank you for what you've done for the community. In the same breath, going to events, I see Izeni's sponsorship at a lot of events. Can you explain a little bit more of that? You mentioned that it's similar to Y Combinator. Is it an incubator where they take a percentage, give you some funding as well, or is it hired out tech?
Yeah, Izeni is just a software development firm. So, but I shouldn't say just a software development firm. One of the few who works with very early stage startups, helps them build their initial product, helps them, get introductions to other community, and helps them transition to a point. Because eventually you can't always do that. Eventually you're going to need your own in-house team, and Izeni helps them transition to that. Now, Izeni has launched something that's similar to Y Combinator called Start Studio. That does bring the mentorship piece, that does bring the investment piece. I think you get $120K, again, similar terms as Y Combinator and stuff like that. But Izeni itself is just a dev shop. It's 60 developers down there in Provo building products.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another one down here. Let me walk the mic there.
So you've worked with a lot of successful startups, but you've probably also worked with some that haven't been successful. What are those reasons that you've seen specifically in the tech industry as to why they have failed?
Well, good question. And I don't know that it's You can have like a blanket, or really even just like one reason why a startup fails, or even really just one reason why a startup succeeds, interestingly. I think it's a combination of a lot of decisions and a lot of different things that have to take place. But if I had to point to one, I would say product market fit. Most startups build a product that the market doesn't want, that the market doesn't need, right? And that more than anything will determine whether your startup succeeds or whether your startup fails. So a lot of folks don't go out and, there's a lot of talk about pivots and changing what you focus on to kind of meet the market. And sometimes that's viewed as a bad thing. The best startups pivot every 2 weeks. Constantly searching for, what do my customers actually want? What does the market actually need? Where do I differentiate myself from other competitors in the market? And where are we going to focus? And the other thing I would say, so product market fit is one, right? And I think that's the most important. And again, on the other side, like a successful startup will oftentimes luck into that. They'll just, I got product market fit, and that'll cover up a lot of stuff for a long time. Zenefits actually was that. Like, they had this product market fit that covered up a lot of kind of internal struggles and internal things that were happening, just because they had found that product market fit. But the second thing is focus. I talked about it a little bit, and we struggle with focus all the time. I think every startup or company does, because there's always something cool you can do. There's always a cool offer coming in. There's always a cool potential product or potential feature you can add to your product, or a million things like that. But you need to be laser focused on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. When you're making huge pivots to completely different industries, or when you're making huge changes to your product that aren't well thought out, and you haven't been talking to customers, and you just think it's a cool way to go, then yeah, you're for sure. So focus and product market fit are probably the two biggest things as to why a startup will succeed or fail. But that's assuming that an entrepreneur has the grit and the wherewithal to go through it, because that too would be a reason why a startup will fail or succeed. We always look for entrepreneurs who are going to make it successful no matter what. They probably aren't on the right idea right now. They're probably not focusing on the right part of the market, but man, I believe that entrepreneur is going to figure it out, right? And that too, having that wherewithal and that drive and just that, energy to say, hey, this is going to suck for a long time. Because most of this type stuff sucks. Most of my job isn't this, and even this, not like this is super cool, but most of my job isn't talking, and having the microphone and being on stage. Most of my job sucks. Most of my job is in my office, sending emails at 11 p.m., So you need someone who's willing to be able to do that grind over and over and over again, and just get shot down over and over and over again. That's important too.
My question's kind of I'm not really wanting to be an entrepreneur, but I know of an idea, and there's a huge market for it already because there's literally hundreds of thousands of people asking for it. Do you know of any avenues I could go where I could get a percent of it but not put a bunch of work into it?
Yeah. So you're looking so you have this idea and you want to find a CEO or a founder to run it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good, I don't know that there's any organization or online thing where hey, submit an idea and I'll take it and run with it. But I would, one, not be afraid to constantly be talking about that idea to whoever you meet. A lot of times folks think ideas are what is going to make the difference whether a company succeeds or fails, and it's not. Everyone has a great idea. Everyone here has a great idea. We all have great ideas for companies. But the only way that's going to be successful is if you or someone you find puts in the time and really kind of hones it in and figures it out. And so never be afraid to like talk about the idea to everyone you meet. That's the first thing I would say. Come to events, Beehive events or other organizations events, and talk about these ideas with entrepreneurs. And you'll find, if it's a great idea and someone like becomes really passionate about it, what will happen, and the amount of energy and time an entrepreneur would spend on that. So I don't know, I don't have like an exact like go to this URL type of thing, but I would say do not be afraid to talk about that idea to whoever you meet, all the time. And don't be afraid to do it yourself, because you can do it yourself. Here's another thing that's I think maybe somewhat critical for college students. No one knows what they're doing. No one knows what they're doing. I've been in meetings with Josh James, Governor Herbert, Aaron Sconard. We just had Lieutenant Governor Cox. They don't know what they're doing. You know what I mean? They're just figuring it out, and they have the passion and the wherewithal to continue pushing forward and continue, their understanding. They go into these positions, they go into these companies, they go into these jobs knowing they're going to fail, but they don't let that, they don't, fail and stop. They don't let failure control, what they're going to do. Because most of these guys have failed far more times than they've succeeded, far more times. And so don't be afraid to do it yourself is what I would say to you. But if you do just want to find like a CEO, I think just talking about it to as many people as possible is probably the best way to do that.
So you talk a lot about networking and getting together with groups, and that your job entails organizing a lot of different groups inside the same community together who necessarily don't have the same schedule. How do you recommend for somebody who's trying to get kind of their foot in the door socially, other than showing up at every single, macaroni luncheon that someone else is going to show up at? How do you suggest, other than just blanket emailing, any kind of strategies, anything to say, anything to do that they can do to help themselves get their foot in the door with these people to make themselves a more attractive candidate for someone to say, hey, you're on the wrong idea and I can see that, but you're passionate about it and we like what you're doing, so let's connect.
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I don't view us as like a networking organization as much as I view us as like, we make connections, sure, but I don't think the best way to do that, and this is probably counterintuitive because we want people to come to our events. I don't think the best way to do that is to come to like a startup conversation series or to come to a launch up or come to, other events that other organizations do. And I don't think it's blanket emailing. I think, that's not how I did it. That's not how I built my network. I wasn't going to every single event. In fact, if I wasn't, and again, this is counterintuitive because I hold events, but if I wasn't, putting on some of these events, I doubt I would go to them because that's not the best use of your time. The best use of your time is to figure out, and this is what I did, so I can only talk about what I did, right? I figured out where can I provide the most value, right? And if I can provide value to someone like, let's say, Josh James, right? How can I provide value to Josh James so that he's super excited about what I'm giving to him to the point where, all of a sudden, he's excited to help out this community. He's excited to help out this organization. He's excited to, throw his own, brand and thing that he'd been working on for a number of years inside of it because he bought into what we're doing. So I think it's primarily not how do I get things from other people, it's how do I give. And I think Gary Vee talks about this all the time. It's like just give, and never expect anything in return. Because the return thing will happen no matter what, right? But if you're finding out, hey, how can I provide value? How can I make this person's life easier? What is this person struggling with that I'm uniquely qualified to kind of tackle or go after, or even not that. It's just like, hey, I'm in. What do you need? How can I help? Type of an attitude. You'd be amazed with the amount of connections and the amount of people just by doing that, just by constantly giving and never worrying about how do I get something out of this. You'd be amazed by how much you actually will get out of it. Does that make sense? I don't know. There's a lot of ways to do it, right? And a lot of people do hack our events and, make awesome connections. Because a lot of, it's not like don't ever go to the events because, you have investors there and all the right people are there. You know what I mean? It may be more like, how do you approach people at the events? What are you saying to them? You know what I mean? Rather than leading off with, hey, here's this thing I'm working on. I need help. Maybe it's, hey, what are you working on and how can I help? You know what I mean? Just like that's that simple twist. You'd be amazed by what would happen if you did that. Anyway.
Okay, other questions? Raise hands. I'll ask one. So for a lot of these, Clint, the students here are kind of so engulfed in studying and learning. What do you wish you would have focused on a little more before you graduated? Now that you've been out, what are the opportunities or the skills or the things that people in the entrepreneurship arena are looking for now from our wonderful students here?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. You're probably not going to get the answer you want. I probably
Never
wouldn't
mind.
have went to school. To be honest with you, I'm not sure that there was. And I shouldn't say that. You should go to school. I'm going to revise the answer. You should go to school. But I don't know that there's anything here at UVU that I took away and has been applicable at Izeni or at Beehive other than my ability to write. Like, kind of go back to your question. Like, I immediately saw like, hey, I'm kind of got this writing thing figured out. I can tell stories pretty well. That's how I'm going to give back to this community, and let's see what happens, right? And so I learned how to write well at UVU. And that was important for me. So again, it's like honing the skill and what are you passionate about? I've always been passionate about that. Excited about telling stories, figuring out how do you build community organizations? How do you, become a community journalist, stuff like that. So I would say here, you're going to learn a lot of crap that's not going to be a lot of very applicable out here, but just buy into it, get through it. And figure out that one or two things that you're excited about. But if you want like a job in startups and tech and you want to build a great startup and tech company, you should for sure know how to program. You should for sure know how to code. Even just at a very basic level, you should know how to do that. Otherwise, it's going to be harder. It's not impossible to start a tech company without those skills. It's not impossible to, build a successful startup. It's harder. It's for sure harder.
And if they get a job at a tech startup, what should they expect, or what's the
Don't expect anything.
life like?
Don't expect anything other than a paycheck every 2 weeks. But don't expect this startup to give you something. You know what I mean? If you go get a job at, let's say, Homey, right? Does everybody know who Homey is? Because you see their billboards all the time. If you go get a job at Homey, make sure they're giving you a check. But don't expect them to make a career for you. Again, you should be constantly giving back to Homey. You should be constantly figuring out, hey, how do I make Homey successful? Because if Homey's successful, you're successful, right? And too often I think startup employees go into a startup and they say, hey, how does this job benefit me? If you want to do that, like, go work at Adobe or go work at Goldman Sachs. If you want a job, like, you shouldn't be an entrepreneur, right? You should be figuring out, hey, how can I make Homey successful or whatever startup you're at successful, and constantly be giving and throwing as much into that. And you will be amazed even by that. If you want to build a startup, the number one thing you should be doing is going to go get hired at a startup to see what it's like.
Okay, let's hear it for Clint. Thanks, Clint.
Thanks.